Emily had always loved surprising her son, Jack. At 8 years old, his curiosity and imagination were boundless. One day, while scrolling through eBay during her lunch break at work, Emily stumbled upon a vintage toy rabbit. It had floppy ears, a stitched smile, and big round eyes. The description read, "Rare vintage rabbit toy, perfect for collectors and children alike." It wasn't the toy's rarity that drew her in, but something about its charming, albeit slightly worn appearance. The price was reasonable, so she decided to buy it. When the package arrived a week later, Jack's eyes lit up with excitement. He named it Mr. Flopsy and carried it everywhere. Emily felt a warm satisfaction seeing her son's joy. At first, Mr. Flopsy seemed like a typical toy, albeit an unusually cherished one. Jack took it to school, slept with it, and even insisted it join them at the dinner table. Emily found it endearing, if a bit excessive. However, within a few days, she noticed subtle changes in Jack's behavior. He became withdrawn, often mumbling to Mr. Flopsy as if having a private conversation. He stopped playing with his other toys, neglecting his beloved action figures and model trains. Emily dismissed it as a phase, attributing it to Jack's vivid imagination. But then the nights grew unsettling. Emily had always been a light sleeper, sensitive to the creaks and groans of their old house. But recently, the nighttime noises took on a more sinister quality. She often woke to the sound of faint footsteps in the hallway, soft but deliberate, as if someone was walking on tiptoe. Her heart would pound as she lay in bed, straining to hear more, but the noises would always stop just as suddenly as they started. One night, she awoke to a feeling of being watched. The sensation was so intense that she sat up, her eyes scanning the dark room. She could see nothing out of the ordinary, but the feeling persisted. It seemed to come from the direction of Jack's room. Steeling herself, Emily got up and quietly walked down the hall. She opened Jack's door gently. In the dim light, she saw her son fast asleep. Mr. Flopsy clutched tightly in his arms. The toy's glassy eyes seemed to glint in the moonlight, staring directly at her. A chill ran down her spine, but she shook it off, closing the door and returning to bed. Days turned into weeks, and Jack's behavior continued to deteriorate. He was no longer the bright, happy child Emily knew. He had become sullen and irritable, prone to sudden outbursts. He insisted that Mr. Flopsy was real and that he talked to him. This worried Emily, but she didn't want to stifle Jack's creativity. She hoped he would outgrow his attachment to the toy. One night, as she was drifting off to sleep, Emily heard whispering. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was definitely there. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was insistent, conspiratorial. She sat up in bed, listening intently. The whispering seemed to come from the direction of Jack's room. Heart pounding, she crept down the hall once more. The whispering grew louder as she approached Jack's door. She paused outside, her hand on the doorknob, and listened. The voices, for there were definitely two, were having a conversation. One was Jack's, but the other was deeper, raspier. Emily burst into the room and flicked on the light. Jack was sitting up in bed, eyes wide with fear. Mr. Flopsy sat in his lap, its head turned slightly to the side as if listening. The whispering stopped abruptly. "Mommy?" Jack's voice trembled. "Mr. Flopsy doesn't like the light." Emily's skin crawled. She picked up the toy and examined it closely. It felt heavier than before, and she swore its eyes seemed to follow her movements. "It's just a toy, Jack," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You need to get some sleep." Jack nodded reluctantly, and Emily took Mr. Flopsy with her as she left the room. She placed the toy in a box in the attic, hoping a night without it would help Jack. That night, Emily had a nightmare. She was in Jack's room, but it was different. The walls were covered in dark, pulsating vines, and the air was thick with a noxious odor. In the center of the room stood Mr. Flopsy, but it was no longer a toy. It was a grotesque creature, its eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth, and spoke in a voice that chilled her to the bone. "You cannot escape me. He is mine." Emily woke with a start, drenched in sweat. Her heart raced as she recalled the dream. She rushed to Jack's room and found him sleeping soundly, seemingly unaffected by the toy's absence. She sighed in relief, hoping the worst was over. The next day, Emily decided to find out more about the toy. She contacted the eBay seller, asking about its history. The seller said he found this toy at his grandfather's house. Emily asked if there was any way to talk to his grandfather, to which the seller replied that he had died a month ago. Desperate for answers, Emily sought out a local historian who specialized in the paranormal. Mrs. Abernathy was an elderly woman with a wealth of knowledge about the town's darker history. When Emily showed her a picture of Mr. Flopsy, Mrs. Abernathy's face paled. "This is no ordinary toy," she said, her voice trembling. "It is said to be a vessel for a malevolent spirit, one that preys on the innocence of children. The spirit feeds on their fear, drawing them into its realm." Emily felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Abernathy looked at her with sad eyes. "The only way to break the connection is to destroy the toy, but be warned, it will not be easy. The spirit will fight to protect its vessel." That night, Emily prepared to destroy Mr. Flopsy. She retrieved the toy from the attic and took it to the backyard, where she had built a small fire. As the flames flickered, she hesitated, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly she heard Jack's voice behind her. "Mommy, what are you doing?" She turned to see her son standing at the back door, his eyes wide with fear. "I have to do this, Jack," she said gently. "Mr. Flopsy is not safe." Jack shook his head vehemently. "No, you can't. He'll be angry." Emily steeled herself and threw Mr. Flopsy into the fire. The toy's fabric ignited quickly, and for a moment it seemed like it was just a normal toy burning. But then, a high-pitched scream pierced the air, and the flames turned a sickly green. Jack screamed and collapsed to the ground, clutching his head. Emily rushed to his side, holding him tightly as the toy writhed in the flames. The scream grew louder, filling the night with an otherworldly wail. Finally, the toy was consumed by the fire, and the scream ceased abruptly. In the days that followed, Jack slowly returned to his old self. He played with his other toys, laughed, and talked about his day. The dark circles under his eyes faded, and his cheerful demeanor returned. Emily felt a profound sense of relief, though the memory of those terrifying nights lingered. She contacted Mrs. Abernathy to thank her for her help. The old woman was pleased to hear that Jack was safe, but warned Emily to remain vigilant. "The spirit may be gone, but its influence can linger. Be careful, my dear." Emily nodded, determined to protect her son at all costs. She made sure Jack's room was filled with light and love, hoping to banish any remnants of darkness. Years passed, and Jack grew into a happy, healthy teenager. The events surrounding Mr. Flopsy became a distant memory, a dark chapter in their lives that they rarely spoke of. Emily often wondered if the spirit had truly been vanquished, or if it had simply moved on to another unsuspecting victim. One evening, as she was cleaning out the attic, Emily came across an old box. Curious, she opened it and gasped. There, lying at the bottom, was Mr. Flopsy, scorched but intact. Its eyes glinted in the dim light, and a chill ran down Emily's spine. She quickly closed the box and took it to the backyard, where she buried it deep in the ground. As she covered the hole with dirt, she whispered a silent prayer, hoping the earth would keep the malevolent spirit contained. That night, as she lay in bed, Emily heard a faint whispering outside her window. She pulled the covers tighter around her and closed her eyes, willing herself to believe that it was just the wind, but deep down, she knew that some things could never be truly buried.